I'm John Batchelor, Hotel Mars, episode N. David Livingston, Dr. Space himself for the Space Show, joins me. David, a very good evening to you.
Good evening to you, John.
We're on our way to Mars this time, David, not fencing around, worrying about low Earth orbit or space launch systems. We're on our way to Mars. There's a study, the NRC Pathways Human Spaceflight Study, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Frank Martin, president of Martin Consulting for many years at NASA, now to help us understand what is to be done and who is to do it in order to get men and women to the planet Mars. Frank, a very good evening to you. David and I spend each week at Hotel Mars, and it's great fun to actually talk about being on Mars. There's a very lengthy study that is available, and David sent me the summary. So I want to begin with the question that comes to my mind is cost. Always follow the money. You're looking to identify the scale of those costs. Have I read that correctly, Frank? Good evening to you.
Yeah, that's right. We took a first order cut at how much it might cost to do such a thing. And that is in the report, yes. And
the scale, does it intimidate people when you talk about it? Or does everybody say that's reasonable, that's rational, we'll get there?
In fact, there's a long history of every time these kinds of $100 billion numbers come up for human spaceflight, there's a long history of saying no. In fact, there's not a lot of public interest. Well, we've got a lot of enthusiasm for putting hotels on Mars, as you've just said. There's not a lot of public interest in spending additional money on space programs, particularly in this economic climate. So that gets to be quite a challenge. But when you think about hundreds of billions of dollars that it might take to get to Mars over several decades, and you think back to after Apollo, we spent hundreds of billions of dollars in today's dollars over that period just getting to low Earth orbit. Shuttles and space stations and all kinds of things that when we look back on them now, today, we look back on them with a certain amount of pride and good feeling, just as we do with Apollo. And so while the public tends to have positive feelings about space programs, there isn't a lot of interest in trying to spend additional money to do that. So that's always a big challenge.
David?
Good evening, Dr. Martin. It seems that the case is made that if the budgets are not there and they go up, they double inflation over the period of time it would take to get to Mars, that the risk is that we lose the perception of being leaders in human space flight, and our programs in space are not nearly as safe as they could be. Is the choice to try to do it with less budget and take these risks, not to do it at all, or find a way to get the budget increased?
I think if you read our report clearly, it says that if we try to do this the way we're doing it, we're going to fail. We're not going to get there. We're not going to Mars, and we'll never have that hotel on Mars. At least we won't. Somebody will build one someday, but it won't be us.
Let's look at the planning for this, Dr. Martin. Frank, entry, descent, and landing for Mars, advanced in-space power and propulsion. Yes, all technical problems, and I think we've got the know-how. The radiation safety, that has always given me pause. What does it mean, Frank?
Well, the big problem you have is, for the space station, for example, there's a certain amount of radiation protection because of the Earth's magnetosphere. It protects the astronauts at some level from galactic gamma rays, which is the real high energy, galactic particles, which are the real high energy particles that come in and cause serious damage. And when you get away from the Earth's protective environment, magnetosphere, you're just out in deep space, and so that's something that's a serious problem. And so right now, having people out for more than about 600 days at a time is a big risk, and the report discusses that in some detail.
And when you say risk, does that mean you think it's survivable, we can build around it, or is it a wall we can't get through?
Well, at this point, it's a wall that's going to be hard to penetrate. Mm-hmm. And I was really talking about galactic cosmic rays. Forgive me for interjecting my gamma ray interest in this. Protecting against galactic cosmic rays for enough time for people to get beyond Mars orbit is just out of the question. So when you look at our report carefully, we basically identify Mars in the next several decades is about as far as you could go managing that radiation risk.
David?
Frank, we in the space industry, I think, intrinsically know the value and importance and the why going to Mars and going into deep space. But what are the selling points to the American people that are not in the space industry? What does the report offer as a convincing reason or why that we should be going to Mars and spending this money?
I think one of the realizations, by the way, this committee wasn't a conventional committee full of space experts or people who are space advocates. It involved people with backgrounds in economics and sociology, conducting surveys, scientists from other disciplines. And what was really interesting for us was how we all came together with the same set of conclusions about what needed to be done and how strongly we all felt about it. And the other thing is that, and Mitch Daniels, Governor Mitch Daniels, president of Purdue University, put it very succinctly. He said, if there was any secret sauce that you could put on this human spaceflight program that made it clear to everybody why it should be done, we'd already have people on Mars. We'd have people settled on the moon by now. This has been discussed over and over again, with very compelling arguments made by more august committees than, say, even the one I served on. So there isn't some secret sauce that's there. And so what we did was look at it from the standpoint of what happens if the nation doesn't have this. And we examined carefully the economic, national security, the education of the STEM arguments, scientific discovery, all those kind of pragmatic things that have been used to argue for going into space. Those are there, and the space program, human spaceflight, does contribute to those things. But when we got right down to it, it was the aspirational things that wound up driving this. And when you combine the aspirational things of, at heart, we have a shared destiny, wanting to explore, wanting to go beyond. It's just human nature for us. It's sort of what drove us across this country decades ago. And human survival. There is Stephen Hawking talks very eloquently about spreading humans throughout the solar system and beyond. And Mars is a first step to see whether or not that makes any sense at all. And so when you take those aspirational things and put them all together in dealing with a couple of what we concluded were enduring questions. How far can we go, and what can humans accomplish and achieve once they get there? Those kinds of enduring questions can be addressed, and when we package that all together, just the thought of the fact that if we don't proceed and if our human spaceflight program vanishes on us and goes away, others will be there. The Chinese and others will be there. They will be doing that. And the thought, after 50 years of very successful leadership in human spaceflight, that future is filled with other nations with their vehicles and their astronauts doing these things, just was something that the committee did not think was in the best interest of this nation.
You mentioned China, and that suggests competition. That worked before, Frank. It worked over the last 500 years to move Europeans to come to the New World. Isn't that same engine available here? If the Chinese do it without us, then we're left out, so let's do it together?
I think it has a little different spin on it, and that is, if you think back, John Kennedy's speech about going to the moon within a decade was driven by the Cold War.
Yes.
Threat of nuclear holocaust and that. So I don't think in the public's eye today, or even in the political eye today, that rationale still exists. And the committee dealt with that, and basically what we're suggesting is that you combine all of the factors, constrained budgets, the importance of building working relationships with other nations. Space station right now on orbit, International Space Station, is a beautiful example of how nations can work together even when they don't agree politically. Right now the Russians, the U.S., the Europeans, the Canadians, the Japanese are all up there, and with some astronauts from other nations, all working together peacefully. That gives us an opportunity to get beyond some of these other things that get in our way here on Earth. And so going together to the moon, to Mars, to asteroids, whatever they happen to be, those can only be good for us.
David?
Do you think that we're going to see budget increases and an actual implementation plan to have a viable Mars program developed?
The President does speak of it, Frank.
Yes, I know he speaks of it, but basically the problem you have is unless there's resources committed to it, our own resources as well as international resources, it's not going to happen. I think David would put it in a different order. I think the plan has to precede the budget. I think there has to be a viable plan that follows the pathway principles and decision rules that we put in this document that Congress asked us for. I think that's a good roadmap. I believe if NASA and the country with the international partners and commercial partners will focus on that and bring that plan forward, I think there's a chance of having that appropriately funded, whatever that funding needs to be.
Dr. Frank Martin is president of Martin Consulting. One little detail here, Frank, just to check off. Elon Musk speaks of getting to Mars. Is private space a shortcut?
I think I love what those guys are doing and reducing the cost of launch vehicles. But let me put it this way. If you look in the report, you'll see that the mass required in low Earth orbit to get humans to Mars is on the order of 2 to 4 times the International Space Station. The International Space Station weighs 420 metric tons. If you stop and think about that, even if the launch vehicle's free, and Elon's doing a wonderful job of driving the cost down, even if the launch vehicle's free, the task of paying for and getting that amount of mass in the low Earth orbit to get to Mars, and we're talking about propellant and life support systems and all that stuff, to get humans to Mars and back safely is a daunting task. You know, we like to talk about, well, we put humans on the moon, we can do this. Well, let me tell you, this is a whole lot harder than putting humans on the moon.
Dr. Frank Martin of Martin Consulting. The NRC Pathways Human Spaceflight Study. You can Google it and get the summary or the whole project. David Livingston, Dr. Space of The Space Show. This is Hotel Mars Episode M.